Hey pre-calc students, welcome to today's lesson on 8.3 day 3. Today we're going to be writing equations of hyperbolas given either the vertices, co-vertices, foci, or asymptotes. So quick reminder that with hyperbolas, the vertices are plus or minus d units from the center. They're always on the major axis. So that was also the case with ellipses, except we use the letter A for those, okay? So with vertices, we're talking about plus or minus d on the major axis. The co-vertices, we're going to use the letter plus or minus e. Those are on the minor axis. And the foci, which are represented by the letter c, those are also on the major axis. Okay? Remember that there's a different equation for the foci compared to ellipses. Okay? All right, we also mentioned that to graph hyperbolas, you need those rectangles created by the vertices and the co-vertices, and the diagonal lines that connect the opposite corners of that rectangle, okay? So we talked about how their equation is written in point-slope form. So don't forget that the m represents slope, okay? That's going to be really important today. When you're talking about slope, you're talking about the change in y and the change of x. So you should recognize that little triangle. It means change in. The symbol is delta. So you've maybe seen it in physics or another science class and also in math class. So change in y over change in x, which some of you are used to recognizing as rise over run or fall over run for negative slopes. Okay? Okay, also remember that the k and the h are part of the center, okay, in the point slope equation. So the k and the h are from the center of the hyperbola. Okay, so first things first, quick reminder, just like we did with ellipses, that the center of the hyperbola is exactly halfway between the vertices and the co-vertices. So to find the center, you can add the x values, divide by 2, and add the y values and divide by 2 for any of these pairs. Okay, so the center is 9 plus negative 17 over 2. And again, it doesn't matter whether you choose the vertices to find the average or midpoint of, or the co-vertices. Some of you also found a pattern, right? That whenever the y values match and the x's values match up, that's your center. Okay, so 9 plus negative 17, right, divided by 2, and should give you negative 4. And then 10 plus 10 is 20, divided by 2 is 10. So your center is 4 comma 10. All right, now just with ellipses, we're going to compare how the center was changed to get to those vertices. So as you compare the center to the vertices, did the x values change or did the y values change? So look at the coordinates of the center, right? And compare it to the vertices. Did the x values change or the y values changed? The x values changed. By how much? So remember, vertices have to do with the letter D. So how did they go from negative 4 to 9? Remember, you can subtract negative 4 minus 9, or you can draw a number line and figure out what's the distance between negative 4 and positive 9. The correct answer is 13 units. The co-vertices, okay, so the co-vertices have to do with the letter E. And notice that here, the y values changed. By how much? Let's see, how did they go from 10 to 17 and from 10 to 3? They added and subtracted 7. Okay, for your equation of the hyperbola, you need to figure out which one is the major axis. So That way you know where to put the 13 squared and the 7 squared. Are you going to put it under the variable x or y? So the vertices are the ones that are always on the major axis. If you notice, they changed the x values when compared to the center. So then that's your major axis, right? Your major axis is the x-axis. Okay, so x-axis is the major axis because the x values changed. So as I start to set up my equation for the hyperbola, oops, see, this is force of habit. I already started writing the equation for an ellipse. Okay, remember that hyperbolas have to have a subtraction in between? Okay, so the 13 is for the major axis, so that's 13 squared is 169. We already said the x-axis is the major axis. And then 7 squared is 49. That's going to go under the y. The center was negative 410, so I'm going to change the signs for the x and the y. Remember that you can pause, rewind, or stop the video at any time. That's the beauty of technology, right? Okay, so this time we're given the vertices and foci. So the center, like I said, it's exactly the halfway mark, so the midpoint or the average between the x and the y values of any given pair, whether they're vertices, co-vertices, or foci. So I'm going to add up the x's and divide by 2, add up the 9's, add up the y's and divide by 2, and you'll get a center of negative 8, comma 7. Okay, so now you're going to compare that to the vertices. Now remember, the vertices have to do with the major axis, right? So compare those ordered pairs of negative 8, 5 and negative 8, 9 to the center. Did the x's change or did the y values change? Here, the y values changed. So that means the major axis is the y-axis. Okay, now you got to ask yourself, okay, well, by how much? How did the y values change? Yeah, by 2, plus or minus 2. Right? So from 7 to get to 5, you subtract 2, and from 7 to get 9, you add 2. Okay, so that's the letter D. Now the foci, if you look, they're also on the major axis. Or if you remember, up here, I just reminded you guys that the foci are part of the major axis. Okay. So the major axis is the y-axis. We already decided it's the y-axis. The foci are, how does the center y value, right? How does the y value of the center compare to the foci's y values? Well, they have the 7, but they also have a plus or minus, and I'm going to represent that with the letter C, plus or minus 2 root 10. So notice that for our equation, which let's not, I don't want to mess this up again, so I'm going to put the minus first. Okay, we already know that the major axis is the y-axis. So, oh my goodness, I'm a hot mess today. Remember that the major axis is written first, right? That's the one that does not have the subtraction. We've been doing ellipses so long that I'm still setting things up as if they're an ellipse. Okay, so you're going to have y first, then x, okay? Because the y-axis is the major axis. So that's where the plus or minus 2 quantity squared is going to go. I'm going to fill in the center. Okay, so I'm going to just it's kind of good I made that mistake because I want to make sure that we review that, right? Um, in the first one, the first example, I forgot that hyperbolas have a subtraction. So that's really important. And here, whatever your major axis is, that's the one that's going to go first. That's the one that does not have the subtraction sign in front, right? Okay, so I need to have the letter E under my second fraction. So in order to find it, I have to use my formula, c squared equals d squared plus e squared. So 2 root 10 quantity squared equals 2 squared plus e squared. So go ahead and figure out what 2 root 10 times 2 root 10 is. The answer is 40. Subtract the 4, you get 36, and that's e squared. You can square root it if you want, but technically we want it as is, we want it squared. So that's going to be your e value for your minor axis. Okay, so remember your major axis needs to be written first, and that's the one that's a positive fraction. Your minor axis is the one that's got the subtraction in front. Okay, so for the next one, we're going to start off the same way. Find the center. So you can actually do it two different ways here. You can find the average of, right, the x's, divide by 2, find the average of the y's, divide by 2, or for the asymptotes, they would always give you the center within the equation, so you can probably be able to read it from there, that it's 9 comma negative 5, okay? So you've got two ways that you can find the center, by looking at the point slope formula or um, find the average or the midpoint of the two vertices. Okay, so as I start to think about my equation, right, I need to know what the major axis is. Well, the vertices always have to do with the major axis. So compare these ordered pairs to the center, right? Did the x values change or did the y values change? The y values changed, right? Instead of being negative 5, they became 9 and negative 19. So ask yourself, by how many units did it change? That also lets me know, since the y values changed, that lets me know that the major axis is the y-axis because the y values changed. That's going to be important because that means that the y has to go first. Okay, so the y values changed by, do you see it? Negative 5 minus 9, or how far is negative 5 from 9? Remember, we're comparing the y value of the center to the y value of the vertices. That's plus or minus 14. Okay, so here is where things can get a little bit tricky, okay? You have only been given the vertices and an asymptote to create the equation, okay? So the equation, remember, has d squared and e squared, okay? The good news is that now we know what d squared is. It's 14 squared. So that's 196. The bad news is we don't have e squared. And they didn't give us the foci to help me find it like in the previous problem, right? So somewhere along the lines, there's enough information that they gave me for me to be able to find e. Now, that's where you're going to use the slope, okay? So notice that they gave you a slope of 7/5, okay? So slope is rise over run, change in y over change in x, okay? So rise over run. So they're telling you that the answer for the slope of this line is plus or minus 7/5. Okay? And the only thing that we know is that the change in the y values was 14. So that's the d. So change in y is always in the numerator. That's the rise. We have to figure out what was the run. Okay, so we already know the answer is 7/5, but we have to kind of solve this proportion. So you can cross multiply to figure this out. Okay, so again, they told me that the slope was rise over run, y over x, change in y over change of x is 7/5. Okay, but in our actual problem, the change in y that we observed from this to these, right, was a difference of 14 units. So there's my change in y, and my job is to find the change in x, because that's going to be the e. Okay, so I cross multiply, I get 7e equals, then go ahead and do 14 times 5, divide by 7, you get 10. And then we can square it to get e squared. Do your best on these, guys, because it's not easy. Okay. I just want to make sure I put the, okay, good. Okay, it's not the easiest. It's kind of like you have to think about it a little bit more, but it has to do with the idea of rise over run. Okay. Let's practice another one. Vertices are always on the major axis. So as soon as you find the center, compare it to the ordered pairs given to you in the major axis. And ask yourself, did the x values change or did the y values change? Okay, so here's x, here's y. Compare that to the vertices, right? Did the x values change or did the y values change? If the x values change, then that's your major axis. So your major axis is the x-axis because the x values changed. By how much? So how did they go from 3 to 15 and from 3 to -9? They added or subtracted 12. Okay? Now, again, start thinking of your final answer, right? We already know that the major axis is the x-axis, so we're going to need the x to come first and the subtraction to belong to the y. We know that d is 12, so that's 12 squared is 144. And we need to find, I'm also going to go ahead and plug in the center. Okay, so we need to find e squared, right? And if I had known the foci, I could have done c squared equals d squared plus e squared, but I don't. So the only thing that can really help me here is this piece of information that the slope, okay, the rise over run, aka change in y over change in x, is 1/6, okay? So notice this time they gave me a change in x, not change in y. So we don't know what the change in y is, so that's where you're going to put the e. That's the one we don't know. We do know that the change in the x's was 12 units. Do you see how in the previous one we knew the change in y was 14, so that's why I put the 14 on the top. But here we know the change of x, okay, is 12. So that's why I'm going to put it on the bottom. And then you cross multiply. So you get 6e equals 12 divided by 6. You get 2. And then 2 squared is 4. Okay, so when you are given the asymptotes, don't forget to use that slope and change in y over change in x to help you figure it out. All right, as always, if you need extra help, feel free to reach out. Have a good day, guys.